Welcome to the Victorian opium crisis. When everyone was a little high, extremely stylish, and far deeper in denial, laudanum cost less than tea, was more popular than rumor, and neatly cured everything except itself. So fluff up your pillows, conceal your vices, and get comfortable. We're in for a leisurely float through history's most stylishly drugged catastrophe. If you like falling asleep to stories of history's most refined addictions, like this video and subscribe for more snug madness. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and the time, because there's something curiously soothing about knowing we're all falling asleep to stories of teacups, tinctures, and just a touch of chemical denial. Now turn down the lights, settle in, and allow yourself to float away with us as we enter a realm where staying quiet, still, and properly attired had a prescription associated with it. You don't know why you're sobbing, but you are. A slow, gracious weep, like your eyeballs are conscientiously sweating. It is morning in your Victorian drawing room, and you have already threatened violence to the chaise lounge merely by sitting upon it too forcefully. Your corset is buckled and primed, your hair has been shellacked into the height of royal disappointment, and breakfast is a desiccated piece of toast held hostage by the butter knife. That's when you stretch out sorrowfully for the small amber bottle residing alongside your marmalade, like a profoundly miscomprehended roommate. You unscrew it. The aroma hits you first, something halfway between a spice bazaar and a ghostly apothecary. You don't bother reading the label. The label doesn't trust you. And really, the sentiment is reciprocated. You add a splash to your tea, stir it with a spoon that knows things, and sip it. Ah yes, the world becomes fuzzy at the edges. Your worry snuggles up like a docile hedgehog. Your husband is speaking, but now he sounds like faraway seagulls disputing over a cracker. You can sense your soul floating out the window, but not in a worrisome manner, as if it's off on holiday and will return by dinner. You slowly blink at the wallpaper, which is now in motion, but politely, your maid poses a question. You respond by blinking again. You have no idea what you said, but the overall sentiment was, I'm otherworldly and can't be questioned. This, you believe, is womanhood with a capital W. In the 19th century, the perfect Victorian woman was dainty, obedient, and preferably 1 foot in the afterlife. She shouldn't have to shout, think too hard, or enjoy herself more than 5 seconds at a time. She was therefore an ideal subject for laudanum, an over-the-counter opium alcohol tincture that could transform any living, breathing woman into something akin to a well-mannered houseplant. Laudanum was packaged in fine glass bottles and could be found in almost any pharmacy, market stall, and tawdry cabinet behind the wallpaper. It was sold as a panacea for everything: headaches, nerves, grief, indigestion, boredom, your children's temper tantrums, your husband's presence, and most significantly, womanhood itself. From an 1868 edition of The Lancet, the sedation of women of sensitive temperament with laudanum has proved to be most advantageous to the household. In translation, your husband finds you prettier when you're drugged. Most of these tonics had names such as Mother Bailey's Quiet Drops, or Dr. Pickering's Restorative for Female Frailty, which is Victorian for I'm about to stab someone with a hatpin. One well-known brand, Godfrey's Cordial, guaranteed to calm the nerves and quiet the soul. It did this by having sufficient morphine to knock a horse out, or at least a pretty stubborn governess. And this wasn't on the fringes. This was mainstream. Every middle-class woman had a bottle stashed in her sewing basket or hidden under her side table. Some used it as easily as they buttered their toast. A letter from one Surrey housewife in 1872 says, I take my morning draught as the sun strikes the curtains. I find it sweetens my temper with the postman, the cat, and my own children in that order. It was domestic anesthesia, legal, available, and extremely addictive. But listen, nobody told you about this over your morning bread and opium. Once you begin, it's very difficult to end. Not so much for withdrawal or addiction, but because, face it, sober Victorian life was not exactly scintillating. You could embroider a doily, sit through another sermon on moral hygiene, or drift serenely through your afternoon on the fumes of a few well-administered drops of oblivion. And once you discovered peace in a bottle, why not experiment? Perhaps in dosing, perhaps in frequency, perhaps in what occurs when you mix it with a bit of wine or pudding or breakfast. Which brings us graciously and ever so slightly inebriately to our next course. You, the dinner table, and the charming tradition of getting your stomach ready for dessert by adding just a pinch more opium. Let's have another sip, shall we? During the 19th century, the ideal Victorian lady was to be pale, demure, and ideally out cold by tea time. Along comes laudanum, the most socially acceptable means of gradually devolving into a whisper in a bonnet. This magical draught, a jolly little 90-proof cocktail of alcohol and opium with a dash of Victorian denial, was available over the counter with the same level of restraint as a bake sale. No prescription, no shame, and no instructions whatsoever. It was simpler to obtain than bread, and far more enjoyable at funerals. The bottles were lovely, handmade glass, sometimes adorned with velvet ribbon because if you're going to numb your soul to jelly, you might as well do it beautifully. Laudanum solved everything. Headache, take a sip. Cramps, take two. Husband breathing too loudly, down it like it's garden party punch. And because the only diagnosis women were officially permitted to give themselves was hysteria or nerves, opium made its way into being the Victorian home's emotional duct tape. One brand, Dr. De Quincey's Elixir of Assurance, was said to restore the cheerful function of the female mind. It made you into a happy vegetable that no longer wonders why you were supposed to embroider 14 napkins before dinner. An 1868 publication of The Lancet wrote in very somber doctor script, "The administration of laudanum to women of sensitive disposition has had a tranquilizing effect most beneficial to the household," which means she shut up, and now dinner is acceptable. Mothers did, daughters did, grandmothers did so regularly that some were likely to be embalmed in it. For one Surrey housewife who wrote in 1872, "I find it improves my patience with the postman, the cat, and my own children in that order." It wasn't only medicine, it was a personality. There was you and there was you, but with laudanum, that is to say rather more easily to host. And no one noticed the issue because how could something so stylishly packaged possibly be bad for you? It's not like there was a Surgeon General to put a warning sticker on the box, stating that this can lead to spontaneous hallucination, moral decline, or light ghosting. And then it became the norm. Wake up, make tea, dose it with sorrow syrup, smile slightly, do embroidery with the fervor of someone attempting to sow their will to live, do it again. Which of course leads to the inevitable question, what does one do when the little brown bottle is your go-to ingredient? Not only in your tea, but in everything. Because having found opium goes perfectly with loneliness and quiet resentment, why not stop at breakfast? Your dinner party is proceeding nicely. The roast is raw. Your aunt has cornered the magistrate on moral decline, and someone brings this gelatin salad that wobbles around like it's possessed. You're in your finest silk dress, and the look of a woman who regrets inviting anything short of her own funeral. And so as the discussion comes around to tariffs on coal and the ethical perils of French fiction, you grasp for the one guest that never lets you down, your bottle of laudanum. It's hidden discreetly in your bag beside your fan, your smelling salts, and that handwritten list of individuals you'd be happy to haunt if you passed away during this dinner. With the elegance of a fatigued duchess, you add a few drops to your claret, then a few more, then enough to make your eyebrows prickle. You drink. The result is instantaneous. Your spine unwraps. Your husband's sermon on drain pipes recedes into the background mist. The beef is no longer important, nor is the gelatin. You're unmoored from your earthly annoyances and start climbing emotionally like a helium balloon full of disappointment and morphine. At the table next to you, a person's kid is loudly reciting a poem. You warmly smile, although you're presently unsure which way your body is oriented. By dessert time, you're 6 inches in the air above your chair and trying to speak entirely in French, even though you don't speak French. You crack a joke no one ever hears, laugh at it anyway, and for a moment confuse the candlestick with your deceased cousin Harold, and yet no one blinks. Because in Victorian society, a lady with slightly shiny eyes and perfect posture wasn't stoned, she was simply delicately handling her nerves. Because in the grand smorgasbord of Victorian medicine, laudanum was the gravy. You served it with everything. By the mid-1800s, the teaspoon here, tablespoon there routine had become a domestic art form. It wasn't just for headaches anymore. People were putting it in sherry, custards, biscuits, and sundry puddings, as casually as one might add nutmeg. One 1859 cookbook recommended adding a few drops to soothe in pleat of a hat pin. And so, with the discussion of coal tariffs and moral peril of French romances, you turn to the one guest who never fails you, your bottle of laudanum. It's securely hidden away in your reticule alongside your fan, your smelling salts, and a piece of paper with names of those you would haunt, joyfully should you expire during this dinner. With the courtesy of a fatigued duchess, you add a few drops to your claret, then a few more, then enough to make your eyebrows prickle. You sip it. The result is instantaneous. Your backbone unravels. Your husband's recitation about drain pipes recedes into distant mist. The beef is no longer important. Neither is the gelatin. You find yourself released from your earthly frustrations and start to rise emotionally as a helium balloon of disappointment and morphine. Behind you, someone's child is screaming out a poem aloud. You smile warmly, even though you're not sure which way you're facing at the moment. By the time dessert comes, you're risen 6 inches above your chair and trying to speak only French, even though you don't know French. You tell a joke no one gets, chuckle at it anyway, and momentarily confuse the candlestick with your deceased cousin Harold. And yet, no one raises an eyebrow, because in Victorian society a lady with slightly shiny eyes and perfect posture wasn't stoned. She was gracefully coping with her nerves. Because in the grand smorgasbord of Victorian medications, laudanum was the gravy. You added it to everything. By the middle of the 1800s, the teaspoon here, tablespoon there had become a home art form. It wasn't used solely for headaches anymore. Folks were adding it to sherry, custards, biscuits, and assorted puddings, as matter-of-factly as one would sprinkle nutmeg. One cookbook from 1859 suggested a few drops to calm the stomach while eating courses full of cream or meat, or when faced with your brother-in-law's politics. Physicians referred to it as a sedative. Housewives referred to it as a survival strategy. Either term, however, dinner was smoother when served with a side of controlled substances. It was a multitasking miracle. Painkiller, mood elevator, personality boost, and if the dessert was dry enough, a welcome flavor bomb. One especially salty note from a Lancashire woman to the Sheffield Times stated, "I find brandy alone dries the mouth out, but brandy mixed with laudanum makes the pudding less monotonous and the guests far more bearable." Enter the age of the well-dosed dinner party where all was either mutely euphoric or so emotionally managed they could endure 5 courses without weeping into the blancmange. The fly in the ointment of making your digestive system a morphine delivery chute, however, was that your tolerance rapidly built up. It began as a light drizzle and turned into a downpour. What was initially a few drops soon turned into a dash, then a lavish pour, and then, oh dear Lord, accidentally finishing the bottle and penning poetry to the gravy boat. And since these elixirs were mostly self-dosed, no one actually knew where soothed met drooling onto the cutlery, but no one dared mention it. Come on, after all, accosting a woman about her opium addiction was as taboo as discussing money or ankles, and as your bedrock dose creeps up a mere notch, just to sleep, you begin to notice something strange. You're waking up fatigued. Your brain is fuzzy and you can't recall whether you've already had your morning drop, so you have another just to be sure, and thus it begins. A bit of forgetfulness, a bit of double dosing, and breakfast comes a bit fuzzier than normal. Which leads us to tomorrow morning's adventure. You, your teacup, and the creeping feeling that you've just overdosed on your own self-care ritual. Let's try that out. You come to with the feeling you've been gently steamrolled over by a mahogany piano. Your eyes are open, but your brain is still asleep, grumbling something incoherent about hedgehogs and half-finished embroidery. Sunlight is softly smacking your face. Your hair has assumed the form of a discarded scarecrow, and someone somewhere is making a noise you recognize only as illegal. It's the maid breathing. As you stagger around standing in your bed, you notice something terrifying. You don't know whether or not you took your morning tablet. You think you did, but you also think your drapes just sighed at you, so perhaps not. You take another just in case, and maybe another for symmetry. 3s are a good number. Queen Victoria approves of 3s likely. You stand up. The ground comes up to greet you. You stride to the dressing table, with the chivalrous resolve of a tipsy Victorian sailor, and smile fuzzily at your face, which does not smile. By the time you are seated for breakfast, you are one further drop away from delivering a fiery soliloquy to the marmalade, which is okay. The marmalade understands. You spread it on toast with the delicacy of a man trying to operate surgery in the middle of an earthquake, and vaguely wonder why everything is slightly hazy, slightly light, slightly as if you've been living in a gas lamp for 6 straight months, which honestly is probably not much from the truth. By the middle of the 19th century, Victorian ladies had fallen into outright laudanum addiction, not with a bang but with a half-forgotten whimper and an empty bottle clinking in the drawer of their bureau. No, the issue wasn't the drug itself, it was that no one was monitoring it. There were no instructions, no dosage tables, No, don't take more than X teaspoons a day cautions because that would have meant someone believed women might be addicts, and goodness gracious, no lady was to be accused of excess. So women started doubling up, initially out of forgetfulness, then out of routine, then because it just did not work the way it used to. What had at first seemed like soft serenity now required a deeper pour, merely to stifle the existence panic of reading Punch magazine prior to noon. In one anonymous letter printed in the Illustrated London News in 1875, a lady confessed, "At first it quieted my nerves, now it merely keeps me from clawing at the curtains." And this wasn't uncommon. It was normal. A daily ballet of brain fog, unintentional overdosing, and sporadic hallucinations that were either drug-related or triggered by the suffocating terror of being a Victorian housewife. Sometimes women started dosing several times a day just to maintain the calm, a mid-morning dip to make it through sewing circle, an afternoon lift before having to suffer guests, and an evening pour to make marital duties seem less like succoring suffocation. Physicians observed finally, kind of. In 1867, Dr. William Brinton penned, "The female patient frequently complains of disturbed sleep and digestion, though pupils are dilated and gait unsteady. Laudanum is frequently suspected, but not often proved, since to question a lady is to court offense. Translation: she's patently stoned on a powdered kite, but we're not going to be impolite about it." And by then, addiction was just a rumor, a whisper, a side effect never spoken, because to give it what it truly was, a dependence, an illness, a result of a society that poured women's feelings into bottles, would have meant that society had to acknowledge it constructed the cage, and rather than acknowledging that, it just gave her another spoon. But addiction has a habit of growing teeth, and sooner or later even the most beautiful woman with the most beautiful bottle will be hooked in the miserable reality of it. You crave more, you're running after the piece, and now it's running after you. So tonight, when the dinner party wears off and your guests have left, and your corset is making its nightly threat on your life, you'll take another, just a bit more. But tomorrow you will discover a new method of taking it, something that strikes harder, possibly blended with something sweet, because once you begin baking opium into your cookies, things begin to get really out of whack, and you, dear lady, are going to be a one-woman bakery of chemical denial. Preheat the oven, shall we? You're in the kitchen. You don't know why. Your hand is holding a suspiciously sticky spoon, your apron's on inside out, and there's cat and flour, or maybe the cat is now flour. Who knows? It was all just supposed to be innocent enough, just some afternoon baking, some nice homey thing, some useful and wholesome as it is productive endeavor to take your mind off the overwhelming burden of being a woman in an empire that believes your uterus holds the weather in its thrall. You were going to be baking biscuits or scones or something spherical and morally edifying. Then you recalled how much more exciting baking is with a bit of a pick-me-up, and how well your laudanum goes with jam. So you threw a few drops in for flavor and health and emotional well-being, then a few more for complexity, then perhaps a tablespoon for texture. Now the batter is giving you the side-eye and you're pretty sure it just mouthed off your childhood nickname. You taste it. It's beautiful, earthy, complicated, like despair steeped in elderflower and surrender. By the time the biscuits emerge from the oven, you're airborne, not figuratively. You've actually gotten up onto the counter and are reading your life aloud in the third person. The maid comes in. You present her with a biscuit and a lecture. She refuses, likely best. But the thing is, they're finished. Golden, flaky, and filled with enough morphine to calm down a small village. You've just created the Victorian dessert. Bienvenue to the high society life of opium-infused pastries, a fad that swept Victorian houses with the same zeal as people now have for gluten-free banana bread. After laudanum became normalized in tea, wine, and medicine chests, the next step was obviously baking it straight into a snack, particularly for women who preferred to conceal their addiction under the frills of domestic drudgery. Now, there wasn't necessarily a formal recipe in Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management that read, "Add 2 teaspoons of opium and sob quietly into the mixing bowl," but there were certainly unofficial ones, scribbled margins, hushed family remedies, and more than a few widowed aunts who shared both scone tins and the recipe for narco shortbread. In a letter to the Ladies' Own Journal in 1873, one housewife explained, "I find that a few restorative drops folded into my seed cake bring calm to my constitution and fewer complaints from the children." Translation: Everyone quiets down and I get to feel like an elegant spook until bedtime. These weren't isolated incidents. A stunning number of recipes at the time freely included soothing syrups, elixirs, or restoratives as optional extras, never specifying that the optional bit might contain opium, chloroform, or cocaine. It was sort of playing muffin roulette, and it wasn't limited to relaxation in the evenings. Some women started using baked goods as timed release systems, mid-morning biscuit for the nerves, lunch tart for the digestion, and a pretty tea cake in the evening to condition the body for small talk and corset rage. Even medical journals reported the phenomenon. British Medical Journal, 1877. It has been brought to our notice that respectable women devour morphine in what they term light baking. Light baking being Victorian for I am full of muffins and lies. Of course, once opium is in your breakfast cereal, you've got it made. It's only a matter of time before you're reaching for it, even before the kettle boils. That's when the addiction really begins to bare its teeth, because whereas cookies crumble, addictions burrow. So next morning, when the headache comes back and your hands do begin to shake just a little, you'll glance at your biscuit tin and wonder perhaps just one to calm the stomach, one to clear the brain, one to keep the maid from seeing your eye twitch. But then again, you could always simply go straight to the source, because if laudanum in your scones and tea isn't doing the trick anymore, it is perhaps time to bring out the big guns. Time to go see the one person who never judges, never scolds, and always has something stronger up her sleeve behind the curtain. Today, dear woman, you are seeing the doctor, and he has something wonderful for women like you. You're back at the doctor's office again. You didn't intend on it, but your breakfast biscuit flirted with you this morning, and that seemed like an omen. So here you are, poised delicately in a velvet chair, affecting that you don't require assistance, while very obviously requiring assistance. The wallpaper's paisley. The carpet's paisley. The doctor's tie is paisley. It's all confidently assertive for a room that reeks of despair and chloroform. You recite your symptoms in the sanctioned Victorian manner. Fatigue, vapors, a constant flutter in the ribcage that tastes like dread wrapped in a bough. The doctor nods wisely as if he's heard this very same set of flowery ailments 17 times today, which he has. He asks how you're sleeping. You reply that you're managing. He inquires about your appetite. You reply that you graze. He inquires if you've had any recent trauma, including too much embroidery, extended silence, or novels featuring French characters. You nod gravely. Yes, all of these things. He opens a drawer with the eagerness of a stage conjurer. There are dozens of small bottles inside, each guaranteeing ecstasy and script. He picks out one marked Dr. Featherstone's soothing elixir for nervous women, and presents it to you as a priest distributes communion. You thank him. He instructs you to use it as necessary. You don't inquire about its ingredients. He doesn't volunteer. You leave with a fresh sense of calm, and the profound, unshakable conviction that your insides are going to feel like velvet infused with moonlight. Victorian medicine was run on a few key principles. 1. Women were all hysterical. 2. Men were too busy to hear them out. 3. Thus, opiates. Physicians prescribed laudanum, as if they were giving out breath mints. Some breath mints had opiates in them, so technically you could get your mouth fresh and forget your childhood all at once. There was no shame, no diagnosis, just a firm handshake, a furrowed brow of worry, and an existential anesthetic in a bottle. Medical texts of the time were brimming with laudatory descriptions of opiates, particularly when administered to women. In the Principles and Practice of Medicine, 1878, Dr. William Osler stated, "In certain delicate cases, opium may succeed where conversation fails." Translation: if she refuses to cease crying, give her an opiate to calm her down. Prescriptions were written for female nerves, neurasthenia, melancholia, and the always trendy wandering womb, which physicians solidly believed could wander the body like a disinterested traveler, wreaking havoc wherever it might settle. Opiates, of course, were a leash, and the doses wildly unpredictable. Some women were instructed to take a few drops a day. Others were given bottles with orders such as use liberally or as needed for hysteria, headache, or proximity to the husband. One report in the London Medical Gazette in 1873 mentioned a woman who showed signs of distress and poor appetite and was immediately prescribed morphine injections. Her follow-up visit was cancelled, most likely because she now thought she was a cloud. Physicians infrequently checked up on them. They just dosed and dashed. If the woman returned paler and quieter, The treatment had worked. If she didn't return at all, well, maybe she'd been cured for good. And so with a bottle in her pocket and new orders to rest more in a world where she had 12 people to feed, and one corset that was trying to smush her lungs, the Victorian lady went home, dosed, lovely, adorned in lace, and slightly more hooked than yesterday. So when the bottle starts to empty faster than it used to, and you begin rotating pharmacies to avoid awkward glances, you'll tell yourself, it's for my nerves, it's for my sleep, it's for my health. But deep down, you'll know the truth. You don't feel better, you feel nothing, and that nothing is starting to scare you. Tomorrow you'll attempt to quit. You'll promise to give it up just to show you can. But quitting, oh darling, that's when things become so much fun. Stick with me. We're going to meet withdrawal, and she's not nearly as mannered as your doctor. You've come to a choice, a stubborn, rational, grown-up choice. You're quitting. No more laudanum, no more midnight nips, no more slipping morphine into your breakfast bowl like it's cinnamon. You're in charge. You are a fortress. You are a woman. Here you sweat. You fling the bottle into the flames with a melodramatic flourish. It doesn't shatter. It hisses like a snake and curls underneath the coal bucket. You think you can crawl after it. But no, this is it. You're free for about 4 hours. Then the walls begin breathing. The grandfather clock is accusing you of something. Your knees are quivering like they're plotting to secede from your body, and your nightgown is dripped with what you genuinely hope is sweat. You attempt to read, but words squirm. You attempt to embroider, but the needle feels like a miniature judgmental sword. You glance at the wallpaper, and it glares back. You've cried twice, vomited once, and halfway thought about nipping a chair arm by evening. Your maid comes in, looks at your face, and softly inquires whether you'd prefer some broth. You retort by whispering, "Make the moon cease watching me." She withdraws slowly. Congratulations, you've officially begun withdrawal, and it is not impressed with your Victorian fortitude. Withdrawal from opium during the 19th century was a dark, unmapped hellscape, and for Victorian women, it was oftentimes met alone because no one thought they actually could be addicted. Rather, they were told they were run down, nervous, or understimulated. The fix for this, ironically enough, was usually more laudanum or a beneficial jaunt to a rest home where they'd be fed sedatives with a spoon until they forgot what emotions were. True withdrawal symptoms were vicious. Trem Gettysburg, cold sweats, insomnia, nausea, hallucinations, mood swings dramatic enough to frighten the typical Victorian houseplant. But because opium addiction hadn't yet been declared a female issue, because women were fragile and innocent, and glided through life like lace-covered swans, no one diagnosed it as withdrawal. They diagnosed it as female agitation, and treated it with surprise, another dose of opiates. An 1871 case report in the Medical Times described a lady of delicate temperament who started shaking wildly, sweating copiously, and believing that the fireplace was muttering threats. The doctor's diagnosis, mental fatigue. The treatment, additional morphine. If you attempted to stop cold turkey, you were usually placed in a bedroom with broth, prayer, and the blind hope that you did not scream loudly enough to wake the neighbors. There are reports, generally concealed within diaries, letters that were never posted, and family notebooks of women crawling on all fours across their sitting rooms, pleading for the bottle they vowed to abstain from that morning. One 1878 unsigned letter states, "I think I shall soon rend my skin from my bones if the shudders continue. I have not told anyone. They would think me mad or possessed, and maybe I am, but if madness is the cost of honesty, I opt for silence and another spoonful." And so most didn't attempt to stop. They merely took less or concealed it better or lied to themselves they'd quit later. But for the minority who did attempt, their payment was a fevered hell of shakes, crying, and the feeling that reality had packed its bags and departed them alone with their nerves and the decorative pillows. And now, dear lady, you're in bed, drenched in sweat, mumbling apologies to the ceiling fan, which won't be developed for 40 years. Your trembling hands will never cease. Your mind is a whirlpool of gibberish, and in the dark recess of your bedroom, you're reasonably certain your great-aunt's portrait just smiled at you. But you're not dead. Not yet. You're only just beginning to see that the bottle wasn't the issue. The mask was, and now that it's removed, the mask is gone as well. So tomorrow you'll wake up different. Not healthier, not fixed, just altered. And when you do, you may find you notice something odd. The scent of your house, the way that the bottles are set out, and the noise, a mere whisper from the nursery. Since now it's not only you drinking the tonic, your baby is sleeping through the night. And that's going to be an issue. Your baby is silent, too silent. You have not slept in 3 nights. Your head is buzzing like it's full of bees and fog, and your bones are right now shaking at a pitch audible only to dogs. But the quiet in the nursery is, well, it's suspicious. You creep toward the cradle in your dressing gown, which reeks of vinegar and desperation. Your hair has become a hostile environment, and you're holding onto the doorframe as if you were a castaway heading for shore. The baby's sleeping, calm, serene, almost radiant. You take the pulse, still alive. You do it again, still alive. You glance around the room and notice the bottle, the one that says Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, the one you purchased 2 months ago, when teething began and your sanity did not. You scan the label. It states it soothes colic, alleviates cough, stills intestinal rebellion, and promotes angelic obedience. It does not mention that it has morphine. But you know, because your baby has not cried in 36 hours, and you are beginning to wonder if she just decided to forego childhood altogether and go straight to sainthood. You lightly prod her arm. She stirs not. You prod once more, and still nothing. You sit beside the cradle, holding the bottle, and whisper, "I think I overdid it a bit." You gaze out into space. The bottle gazes back. You are starting to suspect that this motherhood business comes with a couple of side effects. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was the Victorian solution to parenthood. Overwrought, dose the child. Teething pains, dose the child. Won't quiet down during the bishop's call. Double dose the child. Sold in the 1850s as a miraculous cure for fussiness in babies, the syrup was a family treasure. Its active ingredient, morphine, sufficient to put your toddler into a coma, and your conscience in denial. The bottle never shouted danger. It whispered refinement. The bottle had dainty calligraphy and imprecise guarantees of serenity, but every teaspoon held approximately 65 milligrams of morphine, more than sufficient to knock out an adult, much less a 12-lb human learning to blink. And it wasn't only Mrs. Winslow's. Other fashionable mixtures included Godfrey's Cordial, Dalby's Carminative, Street's Infant Quietness, all legal, all sold at your local apothecary, all meant to transform babies into wee Victorian angels by chemically lulling them into silence. Their outcomes were ghastly. By the 1860s, physicians began to notice something odd: babies who cried no more. Infant mortality was starting to increase in regions where these syrups were widely used, but instead of laying blame on the radiant brown glass bottles, many merely attributed failure to thrive or infant frailty. One letter in the British Medical Journal 1871 cautioned, "We fear too many mothers have substituted convenient drops for good sense. A child that sleeps too soundly may not wake at all." But these were warnings late, and too soft to rise above the gentle hum of a mother at last getting a chance to sit down and think a thought without someone screaming. To many women, these were not syrups of abuse. These were syrups of survival. They were alone, tired, and swimming in lace and expectations. No child care, no assistance, no relief. Just one long, endless cycle of rocking, crying, teething, and critical stares from the midwife. And so they did what everyone else in their world was doing. They administered a little dose, just a few drops, just enough to bring silence. And when the silence was brought, it was holy. But sometimes it lasted too long. Sometimes it never went away. Sometimes a mother would awaken and find the baby still sleeping. Still. You gaze at your child, wide-eyed, hoping for a twitch, a sigh, a snore, and at last, her fingers stir. She stretches, small, alive, blissfully ignorant of how close she was to being a statistic. You cradle her, your body trembling. You whisper, "No more," you mean it. But there on the dresser behind you, the bottle quietly waits. Because the fact is, you didn't bring this epidemic about, you inherited it. And as your daughter matures, she too will inherit something. But that's another day's conversation. Today there are rumors, whispers of women who do not deny their habit, who flaunt it, who consume their opium, not in teacups or syrups, but in crystal goblets behind velvet drapes. For Lordem is not for housewives anymore. It is for ladies of society, and their sickness is cheek. You're sprawled on a fainting couch like a tragic poem. You're not melancholy really, just exquisitely weary, existentially fatigued, religiously reclined. Your maid is smoothing your hair. Your corset has been opened to emergency pastry settings, and your fingers are daintily wrapped around a glass of something dark, fragrant, and about 12% scandal. You swirl it slowly. The bottle labeled laudanum. The invitation said private salon. The hostess replied, "Take a sip and you'll forget the name of your first husband." So of course you arrived. You're in a candle-lit drawing room adorned with velvet, secrets, and women who laugh like they've never once boiled their own water. Rose, amber, and the scent of money hang in the air. A woman's relating the tale of accidentally dosed canopes at the christening party of the Duchess of Belgrave's. Another's asserting opium improves her piano playing even though she has no training and no sense of rhythm. You're nodding in agreement. The laudanum has taken effect, and your soul is floating in its socks. You have no idea anymore what your name is, but you're certain it contains fancy letters. The woman to your left clinks her glass and makes a toast. To health, to loveliness, to being vaguely out of focus at all times. Everybody laughs. You laugh too, and far away you think about your daughter and your doctor and the bottle in your bedside table. But it's okay. You're okay. This is not addiction. This is society. When lordliness became regular in Victorian parlors, it wasn't long before it became fashionable among the upper classes, particularly among women who had the privilege of suffering beautifully. Addiction, if presented in the right way, could resemble great elegance. Aristocratic women held subdued salons, where they sipped opiates from crystal and composed wistful verse on dying roses and aimless strolls. Their complexion paled, their eyes wistful, their words languid and otherworldly. That is, they blended with the furniture. Trembling hands, slow reaction, theatrics of despair were masqueraded as refinement. As long as you didn't drool on the anti-masses, you were just delicate. Lord Muse even became a literary sensibility. Authors such as Cage and De Quincey mythicized the drug in poetry and memoirs, calling it a gateway to dreams, visions, and vaguely disturbing metaphors. De Quincey's English opium meter 1821 Confessions wrote so glamorously of his habit that half Victorian London believed laudanum could be part of the creative process after loneliness and a good cravat. Opium was the not-so-secret swarry guest in the 1870s. Opium was circulated like port, dropped into punch bowls and spooned into sorbets at literary luncheons. It was not rare for women of luxury to listen to afternoon readings and Axe accidentally overreacts into the potted palms. Laudanum was never named in fashion magazines, but they didn't have to. They extolled the faintly translucent complexion, the ghostly softness of the gaze, and the melancholy elegance of those moving as in underwater. In reality, many of the women were quite addicted, but unlike the working-class poor or the suburban housewives, with 5 wailing children and a bottle hidden in the flour tin, the upper class had one benefit: discretion. They had servants to hide their tracks for them, funds to purchase from several apothecaries, physicians who did not inquire, and if matters escalated too far, well, a rest cure in the country was only a carriage ride away. And so they sipped and sighed and drifted through drawing rooms like ghosts in satin, and nobody called it what it was. You exit the salon an hour later, arm in arm with a baroness who just admitted she titled all of her opium vials after Shakespearean heroines. The stars are revolving a little bit. The pavement is optional. Your mind is tied up with ribbon and plush velvet, and just the very slightest hint of denial. You're weightless, gorgeous, utterly invincible, until of course you run out, because nothing destroys a glamorous addiction quite like desperation. And tomorrow, that's precisely what you'll feel when the bottle is dry, when the apothecary scowls, and when your next dosage calls for a little creativity. Because now you have a system, and it calls for paying 5 different pharmacies in one afternoon, while acting like you've never been there before. Better practice your aliases. You're an actress. Not on the stage, of course. That would be tacky. No, your performances are more subtle. A head tilt, a shuddering sigh, a gentle brush against the temple that says, "I am but a delicate flower beset by neural torment." Your audience, apothecaries, your prop, a shopping basket full of nothing but hope's faint glimmer, and your 5th fictitious name of the week. You've already visited 2 pharmacies before noon. One politely smiled at you. The able-bodied one gave you a suspicious scowl. At the 3rd, you attempted tears. At the 4th, a fake doctor's note, a left-handed feather whistle scribbled. At the fifth, you just flopped and whispered, "I haven't slept in days." The piano keeps playing itself. It succeeded. You depart with 2 bottles gently clinking in your handbag like guilty wind chimes. You return home in the victorious weariness of a soldier coming back from a very richly padded war. Your maid greets you at the door. You wobble off with a fluttering wrist. You are drained emotionally, spiritually, and most notably, financially. These apothecaries do not come cheap, and your husband is starting to realize that the household budget has been somehow diverted from coal into coping. But none of that is relevant. You've got what you need. You, my love, have become a regular customer, and now you know how the game's played. As the 19th century progressed, Victorian women developed an informal but remarkably efficient system of multi-apothecary dosing, a polite little addiction economy fueled by desperation and excellent manners. Because while laudanum was legal and accessible, most apothecaries began to frown slightly when the same woman came in 3 times in a week, with stories that involved increasingly dramatic ailments and several fainting spells in a row. So what did she do? She accommodated. She shifted chemists. She put on new bonnets. She altered her name, accent, occasionally her entire history. On Mondays she was Mrs. Arbuthnot with a dash of the nerves. On Wednesdays she was Miss Fenwick, overwhelmed by spiritual torment. By Friday, Lady Godwin, convalescing after the shock of reading a faintly indelicate French novel. This was drugstore theater, and the Victorian ladies were the stars. Some actually maintained unofficial routes, coordinating their week around which drug shop they hadn't visited in months. One discreet letter to the English Ladies' Home magazine in 1874 states, "I find that with a proper time lag, one can call at 6 dispensaries a fortnight without arousing suspicion, though I do suggest changing gloves between visits." This was not thievery, it was survival. For the deeper addiction and increased tolerance, women required more laudanum just to get through the day, but gossip, shame, and suspicious shopkeepers were in their way. So they got clever. Some hired servants to go on their behalf. Some bribed errand boys. Some even forged doctor's slips readily available from some less than honest chemists who knew that a lady in withdrawal was a person not to be refused. The apothecaries themselves operated on a thin tightrope. They knew, of course they did. But provided the coin was good and the lady wasn't shuddering too violently in public, they delivered the goods. This subtle little machine, this waltz of denial and strategy, kept women going enough to entertain, smile, and swoon at socially accepted intervals. But it can't keep going on forever. The lies tangle, the shopkeepers catch on, the money gives out, and the symptoms return with fangs. You wake up 2 days later with 5 receipts, 3 bottles, and no recollection of Thursday. Your husband has taken notice. He's firing questions at you. The maid keeps bringing you broth with suspicious side-eye stares, and the vicar said something during his sermon on moral hygiene. You look at yourself in the mirror. You're pale, your eyes are unfocused, and your wrists appear to be a person who has most certainly monologued to a fireplace. It's becoming increasingly difficult to conceal, and that will mean you'll have to rely on assistance. Not from doctors, not from relatives, not from church. You will need your servants, because if you're going to keep up appearances, somebody else will have to get the bottle, then they're already spying. You used to shun involving the assistants, not out of generosity, of course. Don't be a fool, but out of pride. There's some pride in dumping laudanum into your own cup of tea. Thanks very much. But now your hands tremble too badly to manipulate a cork. So you call in the maid. You tell her very quietly to get a specific tonic from a specific chemist with the blue awning. Not the green one. The green one knows too much. She looks at you. You look back. As addiction deepened among Victorian women, many found themselves relying not just on apothecaries and forged prescriptions, but on the people closest to them who couldn't say no, their servants. Servants in the 19th century were often expected to be invisible, obedient, and conveniently illiterate, but in many cases they became unwilling accomplices to their mistress's descent into dependency. They were sent to chemists with vague notes. They were instructed to refill bottles with other names. They were instructed to stash vials, clean spills, and sometimes wake their employer up after a dose too far. Sometimes they were tipped handsomely. Other times they were threatened with dismissal. In a few households, the maid knew more about her mistress's dosing schedule than the family physician. One entry from a lady's maid's diary dated 1876 reads, "Mrs. does not rise until near midday. I am sent each Thursday to fetch her draft. The chemist gives a look but says nothing. I place the bottle near her brush and leave the room quickly. A few of the servants felt pity. Some felt repulsion, but the majority just obliged, for to disobey was to lose their place, their pay, and their roof. In some instances, the mistresses would blame servants for taking their tonics, usually as an excuse for why the bottle drained so rapidly. Some had their servants fired for having the temerity to ask how many times a day they were supposed to go for medicine for the nerves. It was a secret economy of silence. And yet, on occasional occasions, servants did scribble down what they witnessed in secret journals, in unsent letters, silent witness testimonies now exposing just how much of the Victorian opium crisis was lived behind closed doors between a woman and the sole individual who was paid to look away. You take a sip of your tea and affect not to see the maid's look as she puts the bottle down next to your plate of biscuits. She's regarding you now, not with judgment but with calculation. She knows. Naturally she knows. And you in your silk dressing gown and embroidered slippers are beginning to perceive something appalling. You can't sack her because she knows everything. Your secret is no longer yours. And if she does speak out to someone, your husband, the doctor, the vicar, you'll lose your reputation, your standing in society, even your child. So tomorrow you'll buy her off. You'll give her a bribe. You'll call her dear girl and pretend to care about her views. Because having her on side, that's become part of your treatment protocol. And when that doesn't work, well, there's always home leaving. Not for good, just for rest, just for quiet, just for cure. Because the asylum has velvet drapes and very few questions, you're being sent away, not theatrically, naturally. No one's shoving you into a straitjacket or ringing bells. That would be in bad taste. No. Your husband has quietly recommended at breakfast that you could do with a bit of rest. You assented, largely because the toast seemed to be judging you. So here you are, stuck in a carriage holding a monogrammed traveling bag and a script for prolonged quiet. The footman refuses to look at you. The maid who usually accompanies you has remained at home. Even your corset is awkward today. Like it too has suspicions that this is something other than a prolonged sleep in the countryside. You reach Willowbrook, a rest home for quality ladies afflicted with exhaustion. Victorian for where we store wives who have become troublesome. It's a stone building surrounded by hedges cut into form that feels both floral and menacing. A woman in clean whites smiles at you with a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, and a clipboard full of too many empty spaces. They guide you to a room with lace curtains, a locked window, and a rocker that rocks when nobody is around. You're given broth. You're reassured. You're given a bottle. You look at the label laudanum. You nod. You drink. You're here to rest, and by rest, they mean sedate. By the end of the 19th century, Victorian society had created a solution for women who'd gone too far in opium addiction, or simply, who'd gotten too loud, too trying, or too in the way. They were dispatched to private asylums and rest homes, finery imposed upon them to disguise them as retreats from nervous complaints and female frailty. These were not always hellish places. There were beautiful country homes with gardens that had been manicured, music rooms and daily routines that included embroidery and supervised silence, but the purpose was never healing. It was containment. Most of these women were admitted to these institutions with what would be diagnosed today as substance use disorder, depression, or trauma, but it all fell under one handy diagnosis: hysteria, and the treatment. More opiates, more chloral hydrate, more nerve tonics that sounded like a chemistry experiment and functioned like a tranquilizer dart to the soul. Archives of the London Journal of Psychiatry, 1883, showed that almost 40% of female patients admitted to rest homes were already known to be taking laudanum prior to admission, and almost all were continued on the daily doses after admission. Detox was not the intent, compliance was. Patient letters, when they occur, are usually trembly and eerie. One woman wrote to her sister in 1887, "They say I'm getting better, but I sleep more than I wake. I haven't felt my hands in a week. They say this is good." Workers were taught to control rather than hear. A woman who trembled, wept, or complained was deemed unstable. A woman sitting in silence, gazing at the wall, much improved. Dose her down, restrain her. For affluent women, these places became a revolving door, shipped off to recover, brought home for show, shipped back when the symptoms recurred. For poor women, they were frequently forgotten altogether. It was the Victorian way: tuck the agony in ribbons, lace, and Latin, label it a retreat, mix in some morphine, and hope nobody gets too many questions. You lie in bed at Willowbrook, staring at the ceiling. The flowers on the wallpaper have started whispering again. Someone knocks. A nurse enters. She gives you a gentle smile and a cup of something warm. You don't ask what's in it. You drink. Outside, the wind is howling and you swear it's calling your name, but you are quiet now, calm, still, acceptable. And somewhere within, that portion of you which once shrieked is coiled, anesthetized, and studying how to vanish. But not everything goes away forever, because at some point someone's going to come get you. Someone's going to see. And what if they're your child, the one the one you've raised watching you decline? Because addiction doesn't disappear behind closed doors. Sometimes it jumps a generation. You're back in the house. You don't recall leaving Willowbrook, but you're pretty sure you weren't airlifted out by angels. Well, somebody must have signed the release papers. Your house does look fairly much the same, except the chairs have been pushed an inch to the left, and the wallpaper looks more judgmental than you remember. The maid meets you with an odd smile. Your husband asks if you're feeling better. You'd rather demand to know which iteration of yourself he's talking about, but instead you nod and pick up the teacup already sitting on the side table. It smells of clothes and defeat. In the opposite corner of the room, your daughter sits very motionless. She's grown older, no longer the teething infant you used to dose with syrup of the spoons, but not yet a woman either. She stares at you with the big eyes of one who's read your diary, your letters, and maybe even your soul. You ask her how it's going. She shrugs. You ask if she missed you. She shrugs once more. You push a biscuit toward her. She takes one but does not smile. You recall suddenly all the bottles you ever stashed, all the glasses you ever spiked, all the nodding night stories you read with slurring words and shaking hands. She recalls too, 'cause kids don't necessarily grasp addiction, but they always grasp absence. The inheritance of Victorian Lord and Ham used didn't stop when the bottle dried out. It passed on discreetly, unseen through families. Kids who grew up in families where Lord and Ham was used prolifically usually learned to copy the behavior. They knew when to remain quiet, when to go get the bottle, when to turn a blind eye. Many saw their mothers become doped and confused and thought it was business as usual. Some were dosed themselves, infants, toddlers, even school children given tonics to soothe their nerves or make them behave. Others were just forgotten, left to amuse themselves while their care provider remained in a morphine-induced haze, gazing at the wall covering and questioning why the floor would not quit spinning. Physicians started publishing early warnings by the 1880s about what they referred to as inherited tendencies toward melancholia, an imprecise term that sometimes indicated genetics, but most often simply meant this child seems strange, and consequently so was the mother. In reality, most of these children were just managing. One letter to the Lancet 1886 stated, "It is not infrequent to see daughters of chronic lord and abusers show signs of nervous distress, emotional detachment, and dependency on the very same medicines used during childhood." Others became addicted themselves, many in the same situations, for nerves, insomnia, loss, or the brutal curse of thinking too much. Others went in the other direction, growing up tough and controlled, shunning all tonics, all medication, all frailty, but the shadow persisted. The shame of being the offspring of a lady with ailments stuck like smoke. And worse, in most families, the silence never was broken, the topic never was broached, the bottle vanished, the symptoms were remasked as a fragile character, and history quietly closed itself up, until one morning, the next generation comes across the bottle again, and the cycle repeats. Your daughter is sitting next to you now. You pour her tea. She refuses. You ask if she wants to take a walk in the garden. She reports that she has homework. You smile and nod, but inside something curls up in pain because you see it now. What she saw. You think about the mornings you never rose, the stories left untold, the cradle rocked too long because you'd forgotten that you were the one doing the rocking. She doesn't talk about it. She doesn't have to. She knows, and perhaps she's already made the decision she'll never be like you. But then again, you once said the same thing about your mother, and she once said the same thing about hers, and now you stand in front of the mirror, and you wonder where the cycle stops, because addiction is a ghost that haunts the halls of the home, and your home is very, very old. Tomorrow you'll attempt to clean the bottles out, but you won't be able to find all of them, because some of them are tucked away in your daughter's room. You've begun cleaning, not the ritualistic poking at harmless surfaces with a feather duster, but proper cleaning, The kind that means standing in front of trunks you haven't opened for years, and realizing that yes, you did once possess 4 copies of the same sad poem. You're searching for bottles now, not for consumption, for disposal. You rummage in the sewing basket in the back of the clock in your vanity's false bottom drawer, where you used to stash a spare corset and half a piece of fruitcake. You get one in your writing desk stuck beside an unsent letter. You get 2 others in your husband's study marked as cough relief. You have one virtually in jest in the umbrella stand. You throw them into a sack. You are going to toss them out. You actually are. But by the time you reach the last one, little, amber, dusty, you stop, you unscrew the cap. You don't take a sip, but you think about it hard, and you hear footsteps. Your daughter stands in the doorway. You both stop. She glances at the bottle. You glance at her. Nobody speaks, 'cause in this house, silence is the family heirloom. By the closing of the Victorian period, Britain had started to account quietly, hesitantly, with the magnitude of its homegrown opium issue. But accounting did not equal reform. Not yet. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, which eventually limited access to opiates, was still decades from passage. Meanwhile, families had to pick up the pieces themselves, generations of women who had quietly endured, often being rewarded for their gentleness, their reserve, their enigmatic skill at never complaining out loud. What they did not say was that many of them were numb. They had been sedated for decades, mourning behind lace, drugging themselves into submission, while the world gave them compliments for wasting away so graciously. For others, the bottle was a legacy. Mothers imparted more than hats and jewelry. They imparted coping skills, unwritten rules, and closely held family secrets that began with a few drops and resulted in funerals that spoke of delicacy but never induce. In one of the only surviving wills, which was from 1896, a woman bequeathed a set of hand-painted china teacups, each in tissue, each with a label for a different tonic, to her granddaughter. The granddaughter recorded in her diary, "I have kept the cups. I have thrown out the bottles. I hope that counts as progress." The quiet, gradual disappearance of laudanum from British living rooms didn't result from scandal or from reform. It resulted from weariness, from women, worn out, ill, neglected, but gradually coming to see that the thing passed on to them as a cure had turned into a snare, and quite a few of them, in spite of it all, attempted to break out of it. You do not speak. Your daughter does not stir. The bottle remains precisely in place. You put it down eventually. You take up the bag of empty vials and move past her cautiously, slowly, like you're carrying something that could still blow. She accompanies you into the garden. You dig a grave. You plant them all. No words, no ceremony, no dramatic promises, just earth and silence, and one trembling breath that could be the start of an apology. Tomorrow you'll speak with her. You'll explain to her about the nerves, the doctors, the syrup, the nursery. But tonight, this night, you'll sleep once. Not due to the bottle, because tomorrow something new starts, and it will be the first morning in years that you wake and greet it totally sober. You wake up early enough to beat the maid. No bells rung, no bottles broken, no shaking hands. Just you opening your eyes to the pale light of morning with a head full of things you didn't numb. It's disturbing. You feel it all. The pain in your joints, the growl in your belly, the ridiculous heaviness of your own body just lying in bed like a bag of mixed-up opinions. You sit up gradually. Nothing creaks. Nothing runs down your throat in the guise of relaxation. You are fully awake for the first time in longer than you'd care to know. Downstairs, your daughter is laying the table. She serves the tea. No syrup, no tonic, just leaves and hot water. You sit with her. She doesn't smile. Not yet, but she doesn't go either. You ask her if she will walk to breakfast. She shrugs. But when you rise, she rises with you. You push open the door, and for once nobody is drifting, nobody's floating, nobody's talking to the furniture, or smiling in your face with lies. You walk outside together, and all this is still here: the garden, the air, the sorrow, the possibility. The Victorian opium epidemic never had its moment. No such headlines, no parliamentary hubble-bubble, no moral frenzy over tainted housewives or falling drawing rooms. It just grew old. As controls were tightened, as medical science improved, as companies shifted to less patently addictive substitutes, laudanum faded away, slowly, as did the women who used to consume it by the teaspoon and wrote verse by the firelight before they forgot how to grip a pen. Most of them died without ever confessing they were addicted. Few ever learned the word. Addiction was a man's disease connected with gin and games and gutter ways, not something that arrived in etched glass and floral lettering. And yet their tales remain in letters never mailed, in diaries that trail off in mid-sentence, in the hands of daughters who see their mothers evaporate drop by drop. The opium wasn't merely dulling pain. The opium obliterated the women themselves, not entirely at first, but gently, as a window drape pulled over a window and never lifted again. And yet a few of them escaped. Some hid the bottles. Some cautioned their daughters. Some woke up one morning, went out into the cold, and decided they wanted to feel it all again, even the pain, because feeling, for all its discomfort, meant presence, and presence, however flawed, was a form of survival. You pass by the garden where the bottles are planted. The ground is still tender. Your daughter wonders if flowers will grow there. You respond, maybe, probably. You do not know, but before the day is done, you plant a few seeds in the ground. Nothing extraordinary, something living, something genuine, because there is no monument to women who hurt silently, no statue to the ghosts who sat so still. But this is something, a bent row of flowers in a garden once smelling like chloroform, and somewhere hidden under your feet, the bottles lie, empty, still, finished. And now, while the final bottle is hidden away and the drawing room lays under moonlight and morphine specters, I hope this odd stroll through Victorian opium remains, as the smell of lordom on the lace, or the soft hush of secrets infused in tea. You've weathered comforting syrups, forgetful biscuits, sleepless nights, and medicine so habit-forming it had a monogrammed spoon. But rest time is here. The tonic is spent. The curtains remain. And for tonight the mind is clear. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived another evening within the most elegantly numbed of history's crises. Hit subscribe so we can uncork another odd corner of the past tomorrow night. And as you drift, the soft crackle of the fire will take you deeper, away from fevered hands and velvet doses, and into sleep.